Welcome to the Advancing Surgical Care podcast, brought to you by ASCA, the Ambulatory Surgery Center Association. ASCA represents the interests of outpatient surgery centers of every specialty and provides advocacy and resources to assist them in providing safe, high-quality, cost-effective patient care. As with all of ASCA's communications, please check to make sure you are listening to or viewing our most up-to-date podcasts and announcements.
Hello and welcome to the Advancing Surgical Care podcast. My name is Bill Prentice. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Ambulatory Surgery Center Association, or ASCA, and the host of this episode. We're recording today's podcast at ASCA's 2024 Annual Conference and Expo in Orlando, Florida, and my guest today is Sal Puccio, a presenter at the conference. Sal is a partner in the law firm of Garfunkel Wild and a member of the firm's employment law, litigation, and healthcare groups, among others. Sal's practice focuses primarily on advising and counseling healthcare providers on their day-to-day business operations, with extensive experience in counseling clients concerning the employer-employee relationship, as well as complex commercial litigation matters, more of which we will talk about in just a moment. Sal's conference presentation was titled HR Highlights for the Healthcare Provider, and I've asked him to talk with me today about the advice he provided to our seminar attendees. Sal, welcome.
Hey, Bill, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate being here again this year.
Well, that's great. Yes, you've been a repeat speaker at our conference, showing that, obviously you're getting good reviews and the attendees like you. So that's always a good start. So, Sal, the most common concern of ASC administrators for the past couple of years has been the hiring and retention of qualified medical and medical support personnel. Now, we won't have time in this podcast to cover your entire presentation, but I'm eager to get some of the more challenging issues you discussed, since I know our listeners could really benefit from your experience and advice. So let's start by talking about the issue of independent contractor classifications, since we know it's a common practice to both contract and employ a mix of personnel in a surgery center. Can you talk about the compliance issues that accompany using an independent contractor?
Absolutely, Bill. And it's a great question because it really dovetails with what you said about the need for staffing in healthcare and at surgery centers specifically. And I get calls almost weekly about this issue. Is this person properly an independent contractor, or do we need to convert them to an employee? And we look at it from a couple different perspectives. One is there are compliance issues with respect to taxing. If you're improperly classifying someone, that's a tax issue that the IRS will certainly look into. More specific to the workplace, though, you also face challenges if you improperly classify someone as a contractor. You could be denying them sick leave benefits that many states now provide. You could be not paying your workers' comp insurance. That could result in significant fines and penalties to your surgery center. You could also be depriving them of PTO or other benefits that typical employees of your practice would have. So you definitely have some real compliance risks at a surgery center if you're improperly classifying an individual. But we are understanding that many of the providers in particular and anesthesiologists want to work with your center as well as many others. So we need to go through those on a case-by-case basis. And for those of you who were able to attend my presentation today, there's a new 6-factor test that Department of Labor has just put out, and I've done some other webinars on that and writings. We're going to have to analyze these situations now through that perspective as well.
What's the most common way that one of these situations is found out? So you're doing something wrong. What's the most common way that gets exposed?
Yeah, it's usually one of two ways, Bill. One is an employee gets terminated, fired, or their hours get cut back, and they go report to either their lawyer or a department agency, Department of Labor, typically. The other is, and I just have a client right now that's going through it, just a spot check. Department of Labor just picked up and said, we haven't looked into you in a few years. We're going to take a look and send us all your employment records for contractors and W-2 employees. And then you're left scrambling to figure out, did you do it right or did you not do it right?
Wow. Okay. That's really good information for our audience to hear. So, Sal, following up on the issue of contractor classifications, I know you also address several related compensation issues, such as hourly wages, work breaks, overtime pay, and others. Can you talk about those issues for a moment?
Sure. So there's a subset of case law and litigations that's out there against surgery centers and other healthcare providers. And I think the number one area that I've seen from my research is employment law in generally, that these surgery centers are facing claims from employees or former employees. And within that subset itself of employment law, there's an area of wage and hour claims. And those deal specifically with proper compensation, whether it's sick time, overtime, or just paying wages generally. And the reason for that as being such a hot button area is the penalties that are afforded to these employees are really astounding. You're going to get back pay if you're successful. You're going to get what's called liquidated damages, which is double the back pay. So there's some incentive. And then that individual is going to have their attorney and their attorney's fees paid for entirely. So it really incentivizes those attorneys to come forward and bring these claims. And tying it back to the improper classification, let's say it's not an anesthesiologist, but it's a nurse that you have employed, and you want to employ him or her as a 1099 independent contractor. But it's wrong. They should have been an employee. If that individual worked overtime, you now have to go back and pay them that overtime. You didn't pay it properly as an independent contractor. So you're going to get hit with all those penalties and those attorney's fees as well.
Wow. Well, a significant part of your presentation also focused on contentious employment issues, which is something I guess pops up with a lot of some of the other things we've been talking about that can arise in the workplace and sometimes lead to litigation. And two of the subject areas you covered were matters of alleged discrimination and alleged harassment. Tell us how you would advise ASC owners and administrators to reduce the risk for those types of incidents, and equally as important, how best to respond should a situation arise.
So, this is tricky because no one situation when it comes to discrimination or harassment is going to be the same. You could just have a rogue provider who is acting outside the scope of their employment or acting outside what you would expect of them. So what we try to do is we try to be preventative, and trainings are very important, whether it's internal in-services or larger management trainings that are put on in order to educate your staff members, and in particular your higher-ups, the best way to act. Other things that I find very important are documentation. It's really, really crucial for staff members, whether you have an HR department or you might not. You might just have an office manager or an administrator, but document issues. Let people know what they're doing right and let them know what they're doing wrong. And to that end, we're promoting updating your employee manual, your employee handbook, letting people know exactly where they stand. I just had a situation last week where I have a physician at a surgery center who's upset about their pay. And they're not so much upset about their current pay. It's just they haven't been sat down to talk about how they did and where are they going and what's the raise going to look like. So I said, well, the simple fix is let's put that in the amendment to the contract. And just yesterday we put that together, got it out, and that's going to get us across the goal line of engaging this provider to come back.
Sal, I want to get back to the issue of harassment. Can you talk a little bit more about the ramifications when a harassment allegation pops up or arises in a workplace?
Absolutely. So there are several components that you have to deal with. There's issues with respect to the center itself being either a named defendant or a target, but there's also the reputational harm to the center as well as the individual provider. So it's very important that the investigation is done quickly. It's done under a certain set of conditions, meaning we want to keep it confidential to the extent possible so as not to allow this information to leak out. Sometimes the allegations may be warranted, but many times they're not, and it's just an employee who is disgruntled or misinterpreted something. So make sure the individuals who are going to conduct or lead the investigation are trained. They know what questions to ask, how to ask them, and then you can proceed forward from there in terms of deliberating and determining was there harassment, was there not, and if so, what you can do. But again, it comes down to documentation and training in advance. And at a higher level, if you do have a provider and there are some allegations that are particularly concerning, it is important to involve counsel because you'll have privilege, number one, for part of your investigation on a technical component. But two, you'll have that insight about what could be coming next, what the next steps are. And there are also some underlying issues with respect to potential reporting obligations, things along those lines.
So you would recommend, obviously, that every employer have an employee handbook and that employee handbook is reviewed by an attorney like yourself and not just done once and put away, but obviously you make sure it evolves with the work.
Absolutely, Bill. That's spot on, correct? Because what you have is a lot of state laws continue to change, and some of the topics I'll talk about involve the use of cannabis and recreationally and medically and what's allowed and not allowed. And I constantly, I've been to these conferences now 4 or 5 years in a row, and people want to hear that same subject matter every year. So it's always in my presentation because those state laws change, routinely. We're in Florida now at this site, and in November, it might be legal recreational. So now you've got to look back at that handbook to say, what can I do with respect to drug testing, objective signs of impairment? So there's definitely a lot to stay on top of.
And that's, of course, one of the reasons we invite you back all the time, because this is an area that's evolving, and there's so many areas that impact surgery centers that evolve, which is why we're continually updating our education and our training. And so I realize that neither this podcast nor even the presentation that you're giving here today can adequately prepare an ASC for all of the potential pitfalls in employment practices. And I appreciate the emphasis that you put on preventive measures. Let's keep a problem from starting. Can you just run down a few of the additional educational or training tactics that you would encourage ASCs to adopt?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great part, because we work so much in my practice with healthcare of preventative treatment. I've tried to take that language and terminology, just as you said, Bill, and put it into my teachings here. Number one, continue to go to the ASCA trainings and webinars that are put on. And I'm not even paid to say that, but they're great. They're on point. I attended several this morning, and I'm continuing to learn that information. So that's one area. See the information that's out there, both in person and on the web. Internally, something I found to be really, really helpful, and I've done several this year alone and gotten great feedback, are management trainings. It's something that doesn't have to be state specific, but come in and train your managers. Train them about how to talk to people, about how to do a termination properly, how to document a disciplinary notice, what a performance improvement plan should look like. And that really can go a long way in terms of educating them just on how to maintain that employee engagement and those relationships. And lastly, I think the best thing you can do from a preventative standpoint is document things in real time and address people. Sometimes I find, individuals just want to be spoken to calmly and professionally about their performance, good, bad, or indifferent. So I try to do that even in my own office, where I don't wait for the annual review to talk to the associate. I'll pull them aside once a month or once every 2 months and say, you did a great job here. This is where you can improve. And I look for that same thing from my superiors in the office, and that's what we try to do. And you can really carry that out in your surgery center as well.
Well, Sal, you didn't say it, but I'm going to say it for you. The other thing is that using an attorney like yourself on the front end and having them, review your policies and your practices is likely going to save, a surgery center a lot of money in the long term if they end up having a problem. Would you agree?
I would. I appreciate you saying that, Bill. Sometimes still too humble, not want to promote ourselves, but that is one thing. And using HR service companies are great, using the information you have, but sometimes it's not all you need. And I do definitely recommend getting counsel ahead of the time to look at the issues, look at your handbook, perform the trainings, and provide that guidance. I had 2 calls this morning, literally, before we sat down for this, that resulted in just those issues about how to properly handle these issues. And I think both clients are positioned very well if a claim would be brought.
Great example. Well, Sal, let's end on that. That's, I think, all the time we have. I want to thank you for preparing and delivering an excellent presentation here at ASCA 2024, and hoping we'll see you maybe in Denver next year at ASCA 2025. We really appreciate you sharing your time and knowledge with us.
Thank you so much, Bill. Look forward to being back next year as well.
So before concluding, I would like to acknowledge our podcast sponsor, AmSurg, a leading ASC management company with more than 250 ASC partners in 34 states. To learn more, visit amsurg.com.